Good morning, everyone. Distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen who are joining us this morning. My name is David Ainsworth, and I'm the head of communications for the United Nations Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for today's event. Ladies and gentlemen, 2021 is an important year for nature, with a new biodiversity framework and targets set to be agreed at COP15 in Kunming, China. COP26 of the UNFCCC process, hosted by the United Kingdom, will also have biodiversity and nature-based solutions high in the agenda. We also know that the pandemic has underscored the close link between human and planetary health and the systemic risks of nature degradation. The World Bank has a leading role in supporting countries as they emerge from the pandemic, steering clients to do green, resilient, and more inclusive development, including addressing biodiversity loss. Today's event is an opportunity for you all to see the new World Bank research, which shows how biodiversity underpins economies, the health of communities, and our planet more generally. The Economic Case for Nature, which is set to be released in late June, is part of a series of papers that lays out the economic rationale for investing in nature and recognizes how economies rely on nature for services that are largely underpriced. Another paper underscores the value of protected areas, while a third, released last September, looks at mobilizing private sector financing for nature. The World Bank has also developed a paper that frames biodiversity loss as a development issue and proposes 6 global response areas that could facilitate the transition to nature-smart development. In today's event, we are honored to have members of the team who have prepared these papers. They will show us their work, and we will all have an opportunity to engage in a discussion on this. Before I outline today's event and get us started, let me provide a few ground rules for all participants. First, I want to inform you that the event today will be recorded. Your participation in the event represents your consent to be included in this recording. I also want to mention that the reports being presented today are not yet publicly available. Therefore, I want to stress that you should not share any images, screen captures, or recordings of this event until the release date, which will be in about a week's time, excuse me. This also means that any social media posting about this event is not permitted. There will be opportunities for the social media chatter in the weeks to come, so be ready for that. I would also like to ask all participants to the event to keep their cameras off and also to mute your microphones. With such a large audience, the background noise from even a few people can be very distracting. If needed, we will take control of the microphones to do this. I do ask presenters and panelists to turn on their cameras and microphones when they're introduced, and it is their turn to speak. During today's event, we will have an opportunity for the audience to ask questions in the chat. These questions will be answered following the presentations. A team will monitor the chat and will pass your questions to the moderation team, who will do their very best to direct the questions you raise to our panelists. The questions that cannot be addressed in today's event will be kept and answered by email at a later date. So when you do ask your questions in the chat, please be brief and include your name and institutional affiliation. So now I'd like to begin our program. We'll begin our program today with opening remarks from 2 people, Elizabeth Maruma Mrema, the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and Jürgen Vögele, the Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank. Just a few words about Elizabeth before she speaks. She served as acting executive secretary in the convention in December 2019 until she was appointed executive secretary in June 2020. Prior to this, Ms. Mrema served as the director of the Law Division at the United Nations Environment Program in Nairobi, Kenya. With over 2 decades of experience at the United Nations, Ms. Mrema has extensive experience in global environmental law and policymaking, implementation of environmental and sustainable development programs, and a deep knowledge of multilateral processes. Elizabeth, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, David, but good morning to all colleagues and friends. Good afternoon, good evening, as the case may be. It gives me indeed great pleasure to welcome you all to this important event on making the economic case for biodiversity. As many of you will be aware, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the entire biodiversity community at large, have been having for a long time already strong interest in making the economic case of biodiversity. This has been a key element of our considerable efforts to mainstream biodiversity across government and society, in particular across all relevant economic sectors. Important reports to this effect have already been published. For instance, I wish to recall the important early contribution made by the reports of the UNEP Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity Initiative, or TIB, which were published in time for our Conference of the Parties 10 a decade ago, and in fact at the time helped to inform the development of the previous strategic plan for biodiversity, and in particular strategic goal A on mainstreaming. More recently, Das Gupta review on economics of biodiversity made further important conceptual and analytical progress in highlighting biodiversity as a critical economic asset and no longer to be plundered at will. It created important momentum to further advance the economic case in the context of our recent work on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, as well as the long-term approach to biodiversity mainstreaming that the parties seek to take. The reports I just mentioned are qualitative in nature. For many years, most economists were somewhat reluctant to quantify the economic case and to come up with concrete numbers at the aggregate or macro level. This was due to methodological challenges, probably in putting monetary figures on biodiversity and on biodiversity loss, and more generally on how to insert biodiversity and ecosystem services into standard macroeconomic models. On the other hand, policymakers, for obvious reasons, have strong interest in learning how strong the economic case for biodiversity really is. I'm happy to note that this spanned further research efforts and progress, and in particular, the WWF's Global Future Report, published just last year in partnership with the Global Trade Analysis Project and the Natural Capital Project. The work undertaken by the World Bank that we are going to hear about momentarily builds on this report and provides further important analytical progress and insights. However, at this stage, I will not say anything further so as not to spill the beans, but rather to defer to my subsequent speakers to learn more about that analysis and its results. May I therefore welcome you again, and I look forward very much to the World Bank presentation, and I'm sure all of us will learn a lot from that as we move forward with our work on biodiversity and economics. Thank you, David.
Thank you very, very much, Elizabeth, for setting the scene for us and outlining what's at stake in our work today. It's my pleasure now to bring our next speaker, Jürgen Vögeli. Dr. Vögeli assumed the position of Vice President for Sustainable Development at the World Bank on the 1st of April 2020. In this role, he oversees the work of global practices and thematic groups that bring together the best expertise from across the World Bank Group and from partners to help countries tackle their most complex challenges in the area of sustainable development. The practice and groups under his responsibility include agriculture and food, climate change, environment, natural resources and the blue economy, environmental and social framework implementation, social development, urban, disaster risk management, resilience, and land and water. Dr. Vögeli, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, David, and good morning, Elizabeth. Good morning, distinguished delegates. It's a real pleasure for me, actually, to join you today to discuss the strong economic case for biodiversity. As Elizabeth has outlined in her introductory remarks, there have been a number of reports over the past few years to try to really understand what does it take to quantify the economic value of biodiversity and ecosystem services. But let me say at the outset that the CBD parties are really doing a tremendous work in moving towards a post-2020 global biodiversity framework that is transformative and that is ambitious. So in today's meeting, we would like to reiterate that we at the World Bank support this process, contributing where we can to financing for countries and to the research agenda around biodiversity and ecosystem services. As I join you today, planet is experiencing a massive stress test with 3 converging crises. First, of course, COVID-19 is the biggest shock to hit society since World War II, bringing with it health and major economic disruptions, really of staggering proportions, and the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. Second, climate change has not gone away. In fact, it's accelerating. Indeed, its impact are worsening every year, and if unchecked, it will push 132 million people into poverty over just the next decade, and doing hard-won development gains. Recognizing the very real threat that climate change represents, especially for the world's poorest people, the World Bank Group is significantly stepping up our financing and technical support to countries to make the needed system transformation, including a transition out of coal. Our plan to massively step up our support to countries is actually outlined in our new climate change action plan, which we will launch later today. About half of our financing will support climate adaptation and resilience. Half goes to mitigation, about half to adaptation and resilience. But of course, third is the crisis on biodiversity loss and the degradation of our planet's fragile natural systems, affecting the poorest economies most. As you all know very well, nature is declining at an unprecedented rate, and this may undermine our very own survival on the planet. So what we want to show you today is that biodiversity and the ecosystem services that nature provides underpin development. The work we present to you is part of a series of analytical pieces looking at nature from the perspective of finance, protected areas and tourism, and country-level development. The research in our report, which is called the Economic Case for Nature, shows in very clear terms how reliant economies are on the flow of goods and services generated by nature. It also outlines the risks to economies and people if selected ecosystem services collapse. The poor will feel the impact, of course, the hardest, just like with climate change. They have contributed the least, but they are impacted the most. Once these ecosystem services are gone, many times they cannot be replaced, which is why governments need to factor in this risk, make informed policy decisions, and reverse course before it's too late. So the good news is that nature-smart policies such as subsidy reform, investment in agriculture innovation, and payment for ecosystem services are actually a win-win. They're a win for biodiversity and they're a win for economic growth. You will hear shortly from Gianni about these options. Nature presents us with some of the means to address biodiversity loss and climate change. Actually, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services estimates that 37% of the mitigation necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement can be delivered through nature-based solutions that also generate biodiversity co-benefits. That's why it is so important to really try to quantify the economic value of nature and ecosystem services. So finally, I'd like to stress that the important work you are doing in agreeing on a new global biodiversity target framework must go beyond the negotiating room and reach all the relevant stakeholders in your countries. My message really is to be inclusive and take a whole of government approach. Bring in the ministries of finance, agriculture, environment, along with the private sector and the local communities who depend on nature and the services it provides. I would encourage you to continue engaging with the financial and banking sector as they are instrumental in determining how investment decisions are made. We need to make the public and private financing available to implement these decisions. So at the World Bank, we are committed to work alongside you on the biodiversity agenda. Right now, our active biodiversity portfolio is around $1.2 billion, and 70 of our projects actually have biodiversity elements, but we want to do more. Either our program for the poorest countries supports the implementation or update of national biodiversity strategic action plans in many countries. As countries emerge from COVID, we are supporting their economic recovery. And we are encouraging an approach to recovery that results in a green, in a resilient, and in inclusive development, recognizing that our economies are truly embedded in nature. The G7 is also on board with this approach. At their meeting just a couple of weeks ago, the leaders adopted the G7 2030 Nature Compact in support of the global mission to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. They also reiterated the need to protect the planet, including through conserving or protecting at least 30% of land and oceans by 2030, and increasing financing to nature-based solutions. So we are really proud to be a partner in that global effort, proud to be working with you, our partners in the CBD. Thank you for your time today, and I do really wish you well in your ongoing work. So let me hand it back to David.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vergele. Thank you so much for outlining the work that the bank's doing and the relationship of all of the parts of the bank's program and portfolio. And thank you very much for the urge to action. So thank you so much. So it's my pleasure now to introduce the speakers who will be delivering the presentation on the research we've spoken of. We have two presenters with us today. So first of all, we have Giovanni Ruta. Gianni is the lead environmental economist in the Environment, Natural Resources and Blue Economy Global Practice at the World Bank for the East Africa, Asia and Pacific region. He's coordinating the World Bank's analytical support to the process leading up to the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Gianni has joined the bank in 2001. He's worked on the economics of sustainability, green growth, natural capital accounting. He's supported clients in the ways of preparing and implementing investment project financing, development policy operations, and analytic work. He has extensive experience in Latin America and in Africa. Gianni holds a PhD in environmental and natural resource economics from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and an MA in environmental economics from University College of London. Gianni will also be joined by Anderson Caputo Silva, who is the practice manager for long-term finance within the Finance, Competitiveness, and Innovation Global Practice Unit of the World Bank. And he leads the capital markets, infrastructure finance, housing finance, agriculture finance, pension, and insurance product lines. So Anderson joined the World Bank in 2006, and he's been actively involved on advisory services to develop capital markets and on the design of financial solutions to mobilize long-term funding for strategic sectors. Prior to joining the bank, Anderson worked for the Brazilian Treasury from 1993 to 2005, where, among others, he served as head of the Public Debt Strategic Planning Department, managing the risk and formulating refinancing strategies in domestic and international capital markets for the overall government debt portfolio. Anderson holds a PhD in degree in finance from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So today, Gianni will deliver the first part of the presentation and Anderson will conclude. I just want to remind all delegates that if you have any questions for the presenters, please enter them in the chat. Our team will capture your questions and direct them to the panelists during the question period. So Gianni, I see we have your slides up, so you have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you, David, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It is really nice to be with you, to be with friends, and to give you a sneak preview of this research that we'll see actually the light in 10 days, more or less. So this is the first time we're actually showing this, broadcasting this, actually. So Olga, thank you also for moving the slides, the next slide. So let's start by the key messages. And the way we see biodiversity at the World Bank is really as a development issue. The key messages from the analysis we conducted really underpin this idea. Ecosystem services we know are in rapid decline, the fastest in history, and there is no winners and the business as usual. We also find that the world cannot afford rapid loss of ecosystem services because of tipping points, the collapse in some of them. So we model actually some of the ecosystem services and we look at what would happen if they collapse in a sort of stress test of the global economy. We see that this is particularly bad for low and lower middle income countries. And I would like here to take advantage and congratulate Elizabeth for her appointment as co-chair of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. We think that this type of stress test, this type of analysis will really help a lot in the working of the TNFD going forward. Now, on the good news is that nature smart policies do exist, and they can reduce systemic risk and generate economic gains as well. So there is win-win possible out there. And we use the analysis to look at the 30 by 30 target and see what are the costs of actually implementing the 30 by 30 target. And we find that the achievement of that target is within reach. Particularly if we take into account the co-benefits of nature in terms of climate change mitigation. And finally, the transition to a nature-smart economy needs to be inclusive and fair. I hear some background noise, so if people could mute, that would help everyone probably. So on the next slide, I show that there is a situation. This is a situation many of you are probably familiar with. which you as a Minister of Environment or as a minister in your Council of Government will want to argue that it's important to act on nature. And then you have somebody like the Minister of Finance that may have legitimate question. Can we really afford protecting nature while we need to develop, and what are the trade-offs we're facing? So this is an all too common situation. And to be honest, as we show in the next slide, the tools we have been using to look at these issues haven't helped us much. On one side, you have the typical, on the left here, the typical economic model, a general equilibrium model that looks at different stakeholders in the economy, households, firms, governments, and their interactions to determine the quantity of goods and services that are produced, they're priced, and how much of those are traded internationally with other economies. Usually, this economic model take the economy as separated from nature. It's sort of in a bubble. On the other side, we have environmental models or ecosystem model that really measure things in physical terms and very rarely really tell us anything of relevance to the macroeconomy, to the economy in general. So, for example, we can estimate how much sedimentation sediments run into a river depending on the type of land use upstream. But this rarely gives us information that is relevant again to the Minister of Finance, right? So the problem is that these two type of models rarely connect to each other, and what we really need is a model that looks at how our economies depend on nature and how nature is affected by our decision. So in the next slide, we show how, with the support of the University of Minnesota and Purdue University, we have developed this. This builds on work that the WWF has done through the Global Futures Project and builds on that. So we take as a starting point our typical economic model, to which we can ask policy questions to see, for example, what happens to GDP in the future. And what we do, we connect an ecosystem services model, in the next, yes, here, in which we really embed our economic model into the biosphere. Now, the types of ecosystem services we look at are these four that are indicated here: pollination from wild pollinators, timber provision, fisheries, productivity, and carbon sequestration. So you see that our representation of the biosphere is relatively simple in this case, but still it allows us to start that conversation in terms of how is our economy really linked to those services. So everything you're going to see today is really tip of the iceberg type of analysis, conservative because there are many ecosystem services we are not including at this stage. And one first question you can ask this type of model: what happens when some of these services collapse or we reach tipping points? So what happens when we do a stress test of the global economy? And we show this in the next slide, in which we really present the results in terms of comparison to a baseline to 2030. So all these results refer to the situation, the difference between GDP in 2030 to what GDP would have been in the absence of tipping points. The type of tipping points we're looking at are the collapse in 90% of wild pollinators, which affects agriculture, for example, the transformation of tropical forest into savanna, which then reduces the productivity of timber from that forest, and the collapse of global fisheries. So what we see at the global level is that the economy receives a hit of about $2.7 trillion in 2030. This is remarkable. It's a permanent change in GDP, lowering the curve of GDP compared to baseline of about 2.3% at the global level. What is remarkable is that the countries that are hit the most are low-income and lower-middle-income countries. So here you see for low-income countries, there's actually an adjustment of 10% to their GDP in 2030 if these tipping points are reached. Of course, we know they're uncertain. We don't know when they will happen, but this is sort of the type of stress test that usually financial sector does when it comes to some shocks that can happen. When we look at regions, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia are particularly hit, and this is no surprise because these are the economies that largely depend on nature services in their economic system. So we can build further on the model, on the next slide, and recognizing that our ecosystem services are actually connected to natural capital. So what generates ecosystem services You can click next, Olga, and you can continue with the transition. Our natural capital determines ecosystem services, but we know that natural capital is a result of our economic decisions. So our economic model then is used to see what happens when we take economic decision to natural capital. And we can ask policy question. If you click one more time, Olga, we can ask policy question to the economic model. So we see in this way, we have built a model that provides information of how the economy affects nature, how that translates into ecosystem services, and how those ecosystem services then feed back into the economy. So this creates what we call an integrated global health economy model. And the type of policy questions then we can ask, and this is really the first time this is done at the global scale. In the next slide, the type of policy question we ask the model are of various types. So we have 7 policy scenarios. I start describing the first 3 here. The first one in the middle there, P1, is repurposing subsidies in agriculture. We know we spend a lot on perverse subsidies. What happens if we actually take them away and we repurpose them? We give the money back to farmers in the form of support for land ownership, for example. We also look at other policies like payment for ecosystem services, and we look at a domestic version of payment for ecosystem services with P2, in which we pay farmers to protect the carbon, for example, in the natural forest. Or we looking at P3, we look at the global payment of ecosystem services, in which developed countries pay or emitting countries pay developing countries to protect their forest. Then at the second level, we combine some of these policies in couples. So for example, we combine the repurposing of subsidies with the domestic forest carbon payment scheme, or we combine that with the global forest carbon payment scheme. This gives us policies P4 and P5. And finally, we also look at the impact of investing in agriculture research and development. What if we make agriculture more productive so that it doesn't require land? And we combine, in the case of P6, investment in research and development with the repurposing of subsidies. So in this case, some of the money that we save from the subsidy saving, we invest in research and development, or we combine it with the policy that look at repurposing of subsidies, global forest carbon payment scheme, and research and development. That's P7. So let's look at the result of this policy analysis, and here is in a nutshell what we find, which is really remarkable. On the left side first, we look at what happened to natural land. So the blue bar here shows what happens under the business as usual. So no policy, we leave policies as they are right now. So we are projected to lose about 46 million hectares of land between now and 2030. And we see that each of the policy scenarios we depict actually improve on the business as usual policy. The remarkable thing is that when we combine policies, if you click next here, Olga, when we combine policies, actually a combination of policies, for example, the green policies one improves on the individual policies. So combining instrument is actually very good. And remarkably, you see the P7 policies is the one that spares most natural land. When we combine repurposing subsidies with global forest carbon payment scheme and investment in research and development in agriculture, we actually spare half of the land that would have been lost otherwise in 2030. Now, so we conclude this is good for environment because we're protecting natural land, but is it good for the economy? And this is what the chart on the right tells us. There we see on the horizontal axis, we rank the policies according to how good they are for nature. So we see the avoidance of natural land conversion goes from 10% to about 50% in the case of P7, as we just said. And on the vertical axis, we show the impact in GDP. And again, we see that all the policy scenarios we consider actually improve from business as usual. The benefit, the net benefit to the global economy for implementing these policies is between $50 and $150 billion in our analysis. Now, importantly, if you click next, Olga, here, when we invest in research and development, there is really a substantive increase in economic benefits. Now, these economic benefits, so for example, when we add research and development to the combination of policies that repurpose subsidies and invest in global forest carbon payment scheme, P5, so we go from P5 to P7, The increase in benefit is from 60 billion to 160 billion. And most of these benefits actually accrue to developing countries, which benefit a lot from these investments in technology. So good for nature and good for the economy. So who is it bad for? That's the logical question. In the next slide, we really look at the political economy of policy reform. And taking into account that this is good for the global economy, is it good for individual stakeholders? So we look at three types of stakeholders, which are the ones that sort of capture the revenue from the economy. And these are labor. We have skilled and unskilled labor divided. Then we have capital owners and land owners. And this chart, what it shows is what are the odds that any of these factors of production actually benefits from policy reform, and how often they benefit from policy reform. So you see on the right, the land owners, stakeholders, they tend to not benefit from most of the policy. Actually, they get to be hit by the policy reform. In fact, I need to clarify here that land rents are projected to increase quite fast between now and 2030 because land will become more and more valuable going forward. So what happens under the different policy scenarios, land rents increase less fast. So in a sense, they lose out, but still they increase their revenues, but less rapidly than they would have done under business as usual. On the other side of the spectrum, you have unskilled labor that benefits because the economy is becoming more efficient and ecosystem services do produce services that are valuable to society as a large and not only to landowners. So this is really to say that country-level adoption of this type of policies really depends on reconciling incentives across social groups and ensuring that the transition is equitable. Now, finally, the last thing we do with this analysis, we really ask, what if we implement a 30 by 30 goal? So the way we implement this is we look at our most successful policy scenario, which is the famous P7, in which we look at repurposing subsidies, add to it global forest carbon payment scheme, and add to it investment in research and development. And we know that doesn't take us all the way to 30% protection. So we add to that policy an obligation to protect 30%. It's sort of a regulation, a big decree, global decree to protect 30% of land. So we estimate then what happens to GDP in 2030 when we implement such policy design. So at the global level, you see the result there. You see the green arrow is the benefits from the ecosystem services that actually push the economy towards a better position compared to the business as usual. But then the red arrow is really the opportunity cost of implementing that policy. Most of that opportunity cost really comes from protecting that land. However, the two almost cancel out. So in balance, in 2030, compared to business as usual, the GDP of the world will be 115 billion lower. This is really minor in the order of magnitude of global GDP. We're talking about minus 0.10% of GDP. When we take into account the climate change co-benefits of protecting nature because of the carbon sequestration services, that cost goes even lower. It becomes minus $13 billion. So really, we're talking really about peanuts at the global level. We're talking about 0.01% of global GDP. So this is when we say that the 30 by 30 target is really within reach in terms of economic cost. And again, these policies can be improved because we could expand investment in research and development. Our policy scenario here is really conservative in terms of global forest carbon payment scheme and investing in research and development. But probably there's going to be even a women. The other thing, we don't consider all ecosystem services. That green arrow is really limited by the limit of the ecosystem services we consider, whereas the red arrow is the true cost, of the economy. Now, we would like to see how the distribution of those costs, those 13 billion, takes place among different income groups. If you click next, Olga, we see the distribution. And here we see that the cost in relative terms are highest in low-income countries. So for them, the balance of the green arrow, the benefits from ecosystem services, and the opportunity cost from this policy implementation bring the GDP down by 1.3%, more or less, compared to business as usual. And this is really where we really need to think how to provide the necessary assistance to low and lower middle income countries to mobilize the resources necessary to manage this transition. Finally, in the next slide, to sum up, again, biodiversity loss is financially material. This work provides novel evidence at the global scale of this fact. It's the first time we estimate the impact of tipping points at this scale. This is conservative, it's only just a few ecosystem services, but there is this financial materiality element to it that is really important. Developing countries are most at risk, but are also the ones that gain most from policy reform because they can benefit from some of the nature smart policies we've talked about, whether they are payment for ecosystem services or investment in research and development, for example. What is really essential is a whole of economy approach. None of these can be implemented just by Minister of Environment. It really needs a whole of government and interaction with the private sector to define policies that are good for nature, good for the economy, and they're also inclusive. And finally, the synergies with the climate change agenda, because once we take into account the carbon benefits of protecting nature, the case for nature increases, then we really need to work in synergy with the other convention. And finally, as the reflection, good economics is really instrumental for a successful post-2020 framework. And as it's okay to go to the next slide. Thank you, Olga. Going back to that conversation with the Ministry of Finance, really what we really want is for the Ministry of Environment to be able to talk like an economist and provide its argument forward to the Ministry of Finance. And perhaps the Ministry of Finance realize that sustainability is also part of their tasks going forward. If you are more curious about this, we will be publishing this in 10 days, I was saying. Now, in September 2020, we published a report on mobilizing private finance for nature. So it really looks at the how we go about then mobilizing finance. And Anderson will shortly talk about it, delve into this. And then in a few weeks, we'll provide our approach paper on biodiversity and ecosystem services, in which we provide a menu of response areas globally to really implement this whole of economy and science-based approach to managing biodiversity and ecosystem services going forward. So thank you very much, and I hand it over to Anderson.
Thank you so much, Gianni. That was an excellent presentation, particularly like for everyone connected. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. But I'm very excited about the work that Gianni just presented, because in the bank we work in the financial sector, and this modeling that he has done shows clearly the systemic nature and the economic materiality of biodiversity risks. And then when you have economic materiality, like the financial sector, quickly wakes up, and try to find solutions. So this makes really a strong case for financial market actors to take action to assess, manage, and mitigate these risks. I'm going to be speaking briefly about resource mobilization and the role that the financial sector then could play in supporting the implementation of the global biodiversity framework. So in the next slide, please, Olga. We know that resource mobilization is a major barrier to meeting biodiversity goals, and that nature harmful subsidies, unfortunately, they continue to dwarf nature positive ones. Mobilizing sufficient resources to support the implementation of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework and close the estimated 700 billion per year gap in financing, you require what we show in this slide. Like, we need more efficient use of public funds, we need mobilization of private finance, and we need then to have broader alignment of financial flows with the goals of the global biodiversity framework. I'm hearing some echo. If someone could mute, please. Okay, thank you. What I'm sorry that I lost that. So this need of more efficient use of public funds, mobilizing of private finance, and broader alignment of financial flows with the goals of the GBF led us to write that report that Johnny just showed you, like back in September, the Mobilizing Private Financing for Nature. When you look at the financial sector role, what it can play, one way that we found very useful, and I'll show in the next 2 slides, is to separate between risks and opportunities, and what we call greening finance and financing green. The financial sector can support better risk identification and management, and then can enable investment in opportunities associated with the transition to a nature smart economy. The next slide, please. Here we go first in the part of the risk. There is a lot of progress that is being made in the part of risk. One of them is the recent launch of the TNFD, the Task Force of Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. Scoping information companies will need to report. This builds on the already more developed TCFD. But there are also other developments that are super important that being taken in parallel, like that other important initiatives work on standards, reporting, and metrics that are so important if we want that in the end for the financial sector to operate. This contributes to greater transparency into the risks companies are facing, and as a result of both their impact and dependency on nature. And then following the other line of stream of work is that following the great work of the Dutch Central Bank, the World Bank has been working with central banks of Brazil and Malaysia to help them assess the nature risk exposure of their respective financial sectors. In this process, what we find super important is that we have developed a methodology that will be able to apply in any World Bank client country, and we expect more requests of this type of assessments will be coming soon. And then as ministries of finance and central banks better understand nature-related risks, they can begin then to develop appropriate policy and regulation to help mitigate and manage these risks. And the World Bank stands ready to support these countries, the central banks, ministers of finances in these efforts. Finally, when we go into the opportunity side, which is the next slide, please. When we go into the opportunity side, what we call the financing green part of the story, there are many exciting pilot projects going there. We mapped several different types of investments that are taking place, but we are reaching a stage where it's now really crucial to scale, to scale them up. One of the barriers we identified in the paper we just showed is the need, like if you want really the financial sector to come full force, how can we scale up solutions? So private financial institutions that the World Bank is in communication with are setting aside philanthropic capital to help incubate nature-related businesses in order to develop and scale business models that are bankable. This is an important step. They're working on standards for nature-based solutions in order to increase potential investment in these projects. The World Bank is chairing the Finance Task Force for the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and is working with leaders from banks, asset owners, and real sector corporates to determine what critical actions need to be taken to unlock private investment in restoring the world's ecosystems. The other part that has tremendous potential is the potential capital flows from carbon offsets that are growing day by day. As the price of carbon increases and has potential to increase more. This revenue stream has the potential to have enormous benefits for biodiversity and can improve the financial returns of conservation and restoration activities. It's critical that governments, MDBs, and financial sector all take steps in this part, like to ensure that this money is used to conserve and restore the world's critical ecosystems. Then finally, the recent IPCC report makes this clear statement, and the clear coverage that biodiversity and climate change are two sides of the same coin. We can't meet the goals in one area without meeting those of the other, right? So finance, like this is big time for financial sector. Like I have been working in the World Bank for several years. Like I have never seen like such like a momentum being built towards one initiative, both climate and biodiversity. And then one of the main issues that we are working on is helping measure this, the risk side, help like how we can grow the opportunity set here. And one part that is very important that I didn't discuss here in much detail is what are the financial tools that could be used both by the private sector but also by governments, not to take to take on this agenda and have more mobilization. So let me stop here, congratulating Gianni and colleagues for the great work. That is really good ammunition also for us to do work in the financial sector. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Gianni. Thank you very much, Anderson, for your comments, for your presentation. We're already seeing a number of questions in the chat that we'll get to in just a minute that will address the points raised in your report. Before we go to the questions, however, we're going to get a rejoinder, if it would be, or some remarks from the co-chairs of the open-ended working group on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, given that the report looks at this. Just a little bit about the co-chairs, although they're really very well known by a lot of members of this community. We have, first of all, Mr. Francis Ogwal of Uganda. He has been working for the National Environment Management Authority, NEMA, since 2005 in Uganda. He's also been active in the CBD for over 15 years. He's been Uganda's CBD focal point, vice president of the COP Bureau, co-chair for Reef Mobilization and Financial Mechanisms Working Group, and the first chair of the subsidiary body on implementation. He has received a presidential award in recognition of his contribution in advancing biodiversity. The other co-chair we have is Mr. Basil Van Gaavra. He has over 27 years of experience working in Canada's Environment Department. In addition to being Canada's CBD focal point, his roles included Director General of Biodiversity and Partnerships and the Director of Population Conservation and Management at the Canadian Wildlife Service. He was chair of the CITES Elephant Working Group and also for CBD discussions on Indigenous knowledge and repatriation. He was a co-chair of the International Joint Commission on Great Lakes Water Quality and director at the Meteorological Service of Canada. So I see that Basil has his camera on. So Basil and Francis, we're looking forward to seeing your reaction and comments on the research. Thank you.
Thank you. And Francis, if that's okay, I'll start and then you can, maybe you want to complete my remarks. Good day to all of you. It's a pleasure to join you, and it's a pleasure to see this work coming to fruition. Giovanni has been kind enough to keep me informed of progress, and I've been trying to encourage him in his work. I will focus my remarks on the way forward, and I'll start by one commitment. I'm sure Francis will join with me in saying that we will be being great advocate for this work that is putting some evidence and some work and some numbers around concepts and padding that have been pushing through our work over the last 2 years. So count on us on being very clear advocate of this work and making sure that our colleagues, delegates from the other countries have it in front of them and are familiarized and taken by it. Now, turning to the other side a little bit, and you will forgive me to give you to talk about a few requests, and please, I will leave with you. The framework and what we're trying to do is going to be successful if we're all into it. And it is great to see the work of the World Bank. And if you can continue this work and engaging finance ministers around the world into this work, you can probably do it better than us. You speak their language, you know them. So please continue this. This is going to be very important. Now, on the more technical side, I would be interested in seeing further details and practical solution to implement that international flow of financial resource associated with environmental services. That would be of great interest to us, and that may be a way to unlock the difficult discussion on providing financial support to developing countries. So I'm really interested into that. The following point is the one around the integration of climate and nature. Very, very pleased to see that there is actually an argument for that integration in the work of your work at the World Bank. How we can set up our structures in the way that maximizes integration, not only because we can learn from the experience of climate change, but also because it makes sense. And then when we come down to project financing, and I'm referring there, or financing the green. Actually, the green is a green for biodiversity and a green for climate. So that's going to be very interesting. And then finally, I would say that we were looking forward how we can set up structure where we were closer together with you. I am only a phone call away, and I'll be very delighted to be able to work closer with you on that. So that concludes my remarks, and I'll pass it to Francis. Francis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Basil. Sorry, my voice may not be so clear. Had a bit of a cough, but also my camera might reduce my bandwidth, so I'll prefer to just be on audio. Just to add a few points to what Coach has just said, I think from the presentations of these two gentlemen, I can see that perhaps we begin to change the language to what could be better understood by our policymakers out there better. When we are now talking of figures, those economic costs that I see Giovanni highlighting, and also what Anderson presented, I think other stakeholders out there who might not be doing conservation work, perhaps that could be what appeals to them most, because they want to see really the consequences of them not doing what we expect them to do. And therefore, I really thank the presenters for that. Before I make further contribution, I want to say that I think we have seen that this current pandemic has really shown us clearly the importance of nature in managing pandemics, and that if we continue to destroy nature, it simply means we are going to be more vulnerable to pandemics in the future, and therefore we are going to be more and more less resilient when such scenarios come up. Therefore, we need to invest more in nature. Investing more in nature, in this case, we are referring to biodiversity. And I think we have seen the benefits that the two gentlemen have presented. We are talking about benefits to humanity, health, livelihoods, economies. And in these papers also, we have seen that actually now nature is going to dictate on how far we go to achieve the SDGs. So if we want progress towards the SDGs, then we cannot actually look at nature in a business as usual manner. Having said that, and building on what my coach has just said, looking at the post-2020, which we are all working on very hard now, and looking at the lessons of the current strategic plan for biodiversity, there are a number of factors that contributed to that strategic plan not being implemented. But lack of finance, lack of funding was highlighted as one of those. Now, this is the opportunity. Are we going to continue with that kind of approach and therefore see another 10 years just go down the drain? Or this time around, because we are all now combining our efforts together, we are going to see that the framework itself, once adopted, that it is better resourced this time, because we are saying that by 2050, we want to see us living in harmony with nature. But that is not going to be something that we just say it and it happens. There's going to be a lot of work towards that. So the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, therefore, gives us opportunity to restore nature, gives us opportunity to wisely use nature, to conserve nature, and also to really take action at sharing benefits that we know would benefit everybody on the planet. So for us as co-chairs, we're praying and we hope that once this work is done, see the business as usual approach. Strategic plan for biodiversity 2011-2020. Again, just being cut and pasted for the global biodiversity framework, because that will be a very unfortunate occurrence. We need the next decade to be done better, and it is already declared as a decade for restoration of ecosystem. That is not, again, something that can go without funds. So we need to be thinking a lot differently how this framework is going to be funded this time. And I think such ideas as we have seen coming up here, looking at the private sector and other sources of funding to really complement what will be flowing globally, those are the kind of thinking we need to be thinking about, but also to make sure that we see it in reality and not just in thinking. Otherwise, as we usually say, a framework that is going to develop very well and is not funded is going to be but just a paper. And for us as co-chairs, you can be sure that we will be so really sad with that kind of scenario. But we want to see that this framework is implemented. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you very much, Basil, for your remarks on the significance of this work for the post-2020 framework and looking at how this is going to help guide us or look at our way forward. So we're well advanced in the program. I'll hope we'll have a lot of time here to deal with some questions. We've got questions in the chat that are being sent to me by the team, and I'll start to look at some of them now and put them onto the team. I'm going to ask two questions right now that'll go to Gianni. So Gianni, feel free to open your camera. Actually, I would even invite also Anderson to do the same thing as well, and then Karen Kemper can do. So first of all, Gianni, I'm going to put two questions to you. First of all, there is a sort of a point of information, what is the assumed price of carbon in your model? But also I'm going to put another question. That assumed price of carbon model was from Doreen Stabinsky. The second question, though, is from Ebony Holland of IIED. And Ebony asks you, Gianni, does your model on the economics of 30 by 30 include ecosystem services that support livelihoods and local communities and what they're using and their contribution to managing the land sustainably? So go ahead, Gianni, you have the floor for these.
David, and thank you very much for the questions. I'd like to, first of all, before I start answering, I'd like to really say, give my best thank you to the UK DEFRA for having supported this work over the past few months, but also to the UK again, Germany and Switzerland for supporting the Global Program on Sustainability, which is where this work is housed and where a lot of the follow-up work, including at the country level, can really take place. So if it wasn't because of this contribution, this could have never seen the light. So we're really lucky to have you as partners. In terms of the price of carbon that is being used, because it's a global model, it really looks at economic cost when we need to use the social cost of carbon estimate. And what we use is $171 per ton of carbon, which is what is published in the relevant literature by Toll and others in this field. When it comes to the question of whether, to what extent our ecosystem services really capture the support to livelihoods, local livelihoods, they do. To the extent that our although limited ecosystem services really look at pollination, they look at timber provision, fishery provision, then these are goods on which local communities rely very heavily. For example, local communities would rely on pollinators for their crops, for their vegetables. They also extract timber from nearby forests for fuel or for construction, and they also extract fish from the sea. So to the extent that these ecosystem services change and fluctuate in the different scenarios, their livelihoods are impacted. There are other ecosystem services that are really relevant here, for example, clean water and the impact on, for example, colon cancer or other diseases. So those we don't take into account. So there is a variety of ecosystem services that further refinements of the model should really take into account. But I'd like to stress that yes, the model it's particularly well developed when it comes to the agricultural sector. With the general equilibrium model that we've used, it's one that is well developed in the agricultural sector of the economy. Less so, there is another question there. When urban and infrastructure development impacts will be included in these models. Our model specifically that doesn't spell out that part of the economy in a very detailed way, but that is a possibility, to the extent that we can have the right model embedded in this. we answered 3 questions.
Very good. Thanks, Gianni. So I'm going to take another question that's going to have elements both for you, Gianni, and for you, Anderson, as well. So this is from Carolyn Van Lenders. Carolyn agrees that it's great to have a model that governments can use to explore the impact on nature and economy, depending on its policy actions. So for you, Gianni, how can this be used on a national level by governments? And then for you, Anderson, how can it help greening the private financial sector? So we'll start with Gianni and then off to you, Anderson.
So the economic model can very well be used at the national level. So what we did to serve the purpose of the work in the lead up to Kunming, we really assumed all countries implement all these policies at once. But we can really focus on one single country, which is embedded in the global economy and also has ecosystem, and see what happens when a specific country implement policies. So it's possible, and this very model can allow us to do that. And in fact, it's great, again, to have donors into GPS, the Global Program on Sustainability, because that's the type of work we would like to support our client countries with, implementing this type of tools at the local level, at the national level. And I'd like to answer another question here, if you allow me, David, on the resolution of the model. Somebody was asking, what is the resolution of the model? The model is indeed spatially explicit, and our resolution is 300 by 300 meters. So it's quite well detailed. So again, it will help this purpose of national level analysis as well.
Thank you. Anderson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, David and Gianni. Like, I think that looking at the private sector, and then as I mentioned in my presentation, what I find super useful in this methodology, is how we can then link like policy action to materiality, and then by doing so, we can design a lot of. There is also a question about financing mechanisms that link well to this part of greening the private financial sector, because but also as instruments that governments could use as a consequence of their policy actions, like of the sorts of sustainable linked instruments, where you could have key indicators and targets, performance indicators, and tie the cost of the financing to that, which are instruments very much used by the corporate sector. But we in the World Bank, we are trying to develop a methodology to support countries to issue sovereign sustainability linked bonds. So I see here like two great uses, like quick links from the work that Gianni did. One by having this measure of what policy actions can cause, like in terms of reducing risks. Like we can see risks that private sector could mitigate and have financial vehicles. And second, like for the governments themselves, when they do policies that are doing good for biodiversity, that they could issue instruments that they would pay lower cost if these targets are met. So I kind of addressed here the like 2 questions, because there was also a question about financing mechanisms for investing in biodiversity. Okay, thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much, Anderson. Yes, that was the question from Tayagi as well. So for the next question, we're going to push this question to Karen Kemper. So Karen, could you please turn your camera? But first, let me introduce Karen Kemper, because we haven't had a chance to meet her first. So Karen Kemper is the Global Director of the World Bank's Environment, Natural Resources, and Blue Economy Global Practice. This provides financing, technical assistance, and knowledge solution in areas such as the blue economy, pollution management, forest and landscapes, and environmental economics. Karen has served in a range of functions at the World Bank, including as the Senior Director for Environment, Natural Resources, and Senior Regional Advisor in the Office of the Vice President of the Latin America and Caribbean region. Earlier, she was the Director of Climate Policy and Finance, and she's also held management positions in environment and water resources management in South Asia and Latin American Caribbean regions. Karen, we have a question for you now. Several participants are asking, how will the World Bank use this work? Can we have you share your views on this?
Thank you, David. Can you hear me well? Okay, great. And good evening and afternoon and good morning, everyone, wherever you are. I think this is a really pertinent question in the context of this really good discussion and all of the questions that I see coming in. So what is the World Bank planning to do with this? We stand ready to support our client countries with investments in nature as they relate to the commitments that you all will be making in the Kunming COP. And we think that we, as a development bank, we do need to look at the development impacts of whatever we do. And as you know, in the old times, there was this idea that investments in biodiversity / nature, those were investments that were for a global public good, that affected everyone, but there wasn't really clarity about the positive impact, the benefit for a country. And many times, when one talked precisely with ministries of finance, a little bit like Gianni was showing in the presentation, the Minister of Finance would say, well, you know, this sounds really good, this biodiversity thing, but I've got all these other priorities that are for the economy of the country. So once we have dealt with that, then we can go to the biodiversity or the nature thing, which is very nice, but not high on the priority list. We think that it's right up there, that it is part of economic development. And as a development bank, where it's our responsibility to help support countries in environmentally, but also financially sustainable and economically sustainable development, we will use this as the case of why we support countries, as supporting your commitments that you will be making. Now, this is a global model, but of course one can do that modeling also at as an options analysis at country level, and both Gianni and Anderson have alluded to that. And the other thing that we hope we can do in this context is support the analysis at country level on how to unlock financing. As you heard, there are very many different ways of unlocking financing. Anderson talked about, for instance, accessing the capital markets with sustainability-linked bonds. We heard from Gianni about shifting subsidies and looking at who would be losers from certain types of interventions, and then shifting the subsidies in such a way that you get positive investments and positive incentives, and at the same time you have a socially beneficial impact. So this type of analysis, we think, will help unlock both additional financing into nature and biodiversity, but also internally help shift around funding. So there's a whole body of work still ahead, and where we look forward to working with you and supporting you in what you want to achieve after the Kunming process.
Very good. Thank you so much, Karen. The questions are coming in quite fast and furious now. I have a question now for Gianni, and this links together the climate and nature agendas. Look where they're interlinked and where they don't overlap. And this is from C. Tutanuit. The question is how do you compare, say, a solar plant and a wetland benefit? When do you decide to build the solar plant at the expense of the wetland, and when do you decide the contrary? You know, what valuation tools can be used for this decision? And I think this also links to another question that we've looked at as well. Doreen Stabinsky also noted in her question on the cost of carbon. You know, does the model capture the consequent land grabbing impacts that may result on Indigenous peoples and local communities? So if you could take both of those, thanks.
Thank you, David, and thank you for those questions. So on the solar panel versus wetland, so this is the type of question, this model is not the model you want to use to answer this question. This is really, we are really there in the realm of a cost-benefit analysis, in which you look at the specific location and you estimate the different scenarios of, you know, investing in a project or not, and you you want to include there the environmental impacts of investing in a project. The same applies to building a new road, for example, that goes through a forested, naturally forested area. So what trade-offs you make. And I think the best way there is to really have a partial equilibrium sector, as we say in economics, in which you really look at you take the rest of the world as given, and you really look at the local dynamics, and the model at that point can be much more suited to analyze the issues there. But yeah, definitely you want a good cost-benefit analysis conducted there. On the high cost of carbon and the potential to grab land, I imagine for forest plantations and to sell carbon in the market. Well, first of all, our social cost of carbon is social, so it doesn't necessarily is reflected in the market price. But the question was really, does the model really capture that? And in fact, it doesn't. It doesn't get to that level of to the micro level of which are the specific communities that are affected by a conversion. So again, I think a more detailed analysis that doesn't rely on a general equilibrium model would be more suited there. So in a sense, these are very important questions, and economics has different tools for different questions in the end, and I think we shouldn't dismiss those. These models don't answer all questions under the sky.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Gianni. I'm going to turn now to Anderson. We have a question from Sebastian Becker of UNFCCC. He'd like you to provide more detail on the support to central banks, for example, in Brazil and Malaysia in particular. And will this support use the same methodology and data as we saw in the DNB PBL approach that was alluded to in the chat?
Thanks so much, David. And thanks for the question. Now, as I mentioned in the presentation, we see that with great potential in terms of the work that we do in Brazil and Malaysia. Indeed, like we are building on and using as a base the model that we used by the Dutch National Bank. We are actually working together in collaboration with them, but also with Bank of England and Banque de France in this methodology. So we are trying to expand the experience that the Deutsche National Bank had. So it's very promising, and we wish to be able to be also disseminating more the methodology that is built out of this exercise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anderson. Gianni, I'd like to take a directed question to you from Xavier. He thanks you for your presentation and points out that if we are incorporating spending on biodiversity national accounts, this may reduce GDP economic growth indicators due to the negative impact from ecosystem losses on the economy. So taking this into context, what's the recommendation to deal with the Ministry of Finance when they have limited decision to change policies in these matters?
That's a very good point, and this is exactly why you want to embed your economic model into the biosphere, because the economy does benefit from ecosystem services. So pollination, for example, makes agriculture more productive. A forest that is well managed makes timber available over the long term. A fishery that is well managed, the same. So this is exactly the type of thing. This is how we can show that the policies we implement are win-wins for nature and the economy. So the balance is really, really positive. Some work that the bank is conducting in Indonesia is really looking at peatlands in the economy of peatlands, and that very trade-off is really, really crucial there, and it's analyzed. And again, once you start taking into account the ecosystem benefits, then your equation really change. Now, in terms of how do you then make it happen? How nature can have an economic value, but doesn't necessarily at the end of the day pay for itself. So it's either a public policy that sees the balance and says this is good for society, will make my economy more resilient, or it's really a consumer and investor decision. This is why we're really looking, and we're I feel so productive and stronger when we work in collaboration with our finance colleague, with Anderson's team, because we don't have economists don't have all the answers. You do need to find some answers in investment decisions and what drives their choice to invest in a portfolio or another, because they may be responded to consumers and or upstream investors even. So I think that's really another important aspect of the equation there. And I really appreciate Francis and Basil's. I think this is where biodiversity is probably different from climate change, because we don't have a market yet. Carbon market is picking up again, but for biodiversity, there's not such a thing, and we're probably far from something similar. But then we really need to rely on those mechanisms to make the difference.
Very good. Thank you very much, Gianni. So speaking of the co-chairs, actually, Francis, Basil, we have a question that we're going to direct to you. So we have Claudiana Marica, who's with the Ministry of Tourism and Environment of Albania. Claudiana mentions that Anderson Silva talked about the need for nature-smart financial mechanisms and sustainability policies at the national level. So is it possible to use these sort of approaches and methodologies and to mainstream them into the NBSAPs to reach sustainability and to also to mainstream nature risks?
The answer is I don't know. We'll know when we get the frameworks agreed, but I can give you some answer. There is lots of discussion about the NBSAPs having a stronger and more robust financial plan attached to it or part of it. So I heard many parties supporting the idea that a lot of what has been done with external biodiversity finance plans being integrated in the NBSAPs, and then having that portion of the work that needs to be done at the domestic or national level also being supported in that. So kind of a two-step approach where there is a national plan that look internally what can be done, and then the international financing components coming on top of it. But definitively more transparent, more robust, and more comprehensive financial plans will be part of the equation if we want to be successful. I don't know if Francis may want to have some to add.
Yes, Francis, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you, Co-Chair. I think this, I would look at it, in addition to what Basil said, look at this very closely under climate change is climate smart agriculture. And I think this gained a lot of momentum on the way for conducting or carrying out agriculture that is climate smart. And policymakers tend to listen to that. But in this case also, we are looking at nature smart development. I think it is much more than just agriculture. It is much more broader in concept here. And therefore, yes, one would look at it as having the potential to influence mainstreaming in NBSAP. But something that we should all be conscious about is that how far will the mainstreaming go? Because if a sector just mainstreams biodiversity but does not allocate resources towards it, then that also remains something that, yes, you read it on paper, you say Uganda has mainstreamed this and that, this sector, this has a mainstream, but are they allocating resources that goes towards implementing those activities that they have mainstreamed? So that could be the other angle in which we go beyond just the mainstreaming, maybe in the paperwork, but look at the resource allocation by sectors. How much is that going towards conservation work? Even if it doesn't come to Ministry of Environment or whatever, but is the other sector really doing something conservation related? Do they have a budget that helps them to effect the mainstreaming that they've done or not? So that is the bit. So it should go just beyond the mainstreaming per se, and also look at the resource allocation and other indicators that can show us, yes, the mainstreaming has been done and is effective. So as Co-Chair said, it can be difficult to see how far it goes at this point in time. We'll see how our discussion will go. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis. We have a question from Johannes Cruz of GIZ. I'm going to direct this question to Gianni. The work that you presented today, does it feed into macroeconomic indicators from the Beyond GDP approach, for example?
This is an excellent question. So it does. So the modeling work we just presented, it's really the other side of the coin of the sustainability work we do with, for example, estimating comprehensive wealth or inclusive wealth, how it is, as it is referred in the That's Good review. So what you want to go beyond GDP is to really measure not what you produce in terms of income in a year. You want to measure welfare. You want to measure, what are the prospects for society to be well off going into the future. And the way you measure welfare is through measuring wealth. Measure the assets on which the economy relies. And those assets need to be measured in an inclusive way, in a comprehensive way. Our Changing Wealth of Nation work does exactly that. Measures wealth, including produced capital, natural capital, and human capital in a comprehensive way. So when wealth increases, because you're investing in your assets, then your welfare increases and of course GDP as well. But when wealth decreases, you're becoming worse off. Actually, you're less sustainable. Your GDP may be increasing, but if your wealth goes down, then you will have trouble somewhere in the future. So that's why. And then the modeling work we just did is actually what you need to estimate wealth today, because your wealth today really depends on how you treat your environment, how you see that flow of services panning into the future. That's what gives value to wealth. So the modeling sort of gives is the guts of the wealth estimates, and they are very related. So what I presented today doesn't talk much about beyond GDP, but informs the beyond GDP in terms of the wealth estimates. I hope I wasn't too theoretical, but really that's the intuition.
Great,
and I wanted to say, Dave, if you may allow, I just remembered on the question of livelihoods, I forgot to mention another piece of work we undertook this year is to look at the benefits of protected areas. So when we look, a key benefit to some of local communities is nature-based tourism. They get to take advantage from a lot of the money the tourists spend because they buy food, they buy services locally. So we look at the multipliers of investing $1 in a protected area, how much that generates in the local economy. And in some places it generates up to $7 in terms of local economy benefits. And this study just came out, was published 2 weeks ago, and it's available for sharing. I'll try to find it and put it in the chat. But it's really something that also look at that livelihood.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're going to take one more question. I think I have time for this, and then we'll move to closing the event here. Again, this is for Gianni. You're the one on the hot seat now. This is from Mark Opel. And Mark asks, how does the economic work compare to other similar analysis? For example, Mark mentions the Waldron report.
Thank you, Mark. This is a very important question. So in fact, we took the 30 by 30 scenario from one of Waldron scenarios. What we did, we built on that by applying that to a general equilibrium setting. So in terms of estimating the cost to the economy, you will see our numbers really say when we protect 30% of the planet, that will have implications for the economy because of the ecosystem services like pollination will be more protected, timber provision will be different, fisheries, etc. So that feeds back into the economy and allows us to estimate that net cost calculation that I was referring to. So that's something Waldron doesn't do. It doesn't get to that sort of general equilibrium setting there. But we did use the same information in terms of defining where the 30% protection should happen. So we took the midway projection from Waldron.
Very
Very
good.
exciting moment. There is really a proliferation of work in this area. So this is really, we are in the dawn of a very exciting era, I think, on this type of issues.
That's good. We have the tools we'll need for our work in the next 10, 20 years. So thanks for the questions. I think we addressed most of them. The team will go through the discussion and we'll find ways to address or look at the other ones too. I also invite people to look at the different links that are being posted by members of the World Bank team to research that has come out. To help us bring the event to a close, I'd like to bring Karen Kemper back to the podium. Actually, before I do so, but thank you very much, Anderson. Thank you, Gianni, for your work, for taking the questions, and thank you for your continued engagement on these issues. So Karen Kemper will now get a chance to speak and give us a little bit of a sense of this work and where we're going. Karen, the floor is yours.
Thanks, David, and thank you, all of you, and the CBD Secretariat for the opportunity to present the World Bank's latest thinking on biodiversity, and for the very rich discussion today, which has really inspired me. And it shows us as a team that we hopefully are useful to you in supporting what you want to be doing. Now, as you've seen, the evidence base is building for nature's immense contribution to economies. And I don't think we can stress enough how biodiversity and ecosystem services contribute to our economies and to the well-being of communities. And in fact, 44 trillion of global value added, or more than half of the world's GDP, is highly or moderately dependent on ecosystem services. To illustrate that point, 75% of food crops and up to $577 billion of annual crop output relies on animal pollination. You would never be able to do that either by hand or with machines in order to replace that type of pollination that happens through animals and majorly through insects. So functioning ecosystems are also critical to efforts to reduce poverty reduction, migration and conflicts, and to create more resilient livelihoods. And these are all issues that the World Bank is working on very hard. The analysis that you heard today also underpins a post-COVID recovery that is green, resilient, and inclusive. And the kind of future we want to build as we emerge from the pandemic must have nature at its core. So as the G7 leader said earlier this month, and we really think that this is a major milestone to have the G7 leaders actually talk majorly about nature, we have a duty to safeguard our planet for future generations by supporting a green revolution that creates jobs and cuts emissions and limits temperature rise. And the G7 leaders also committed to the 30 by 30 pledge that we were discussing, and that's encapsulated in the work that you all are doing. The good news is that the 30 by 30 goal is actually well within our reach and at a comparatively moderate economic cost. The G7 leaders are also committed to increasing nature-based solutions by 2025 and ensuring that nature is included in policy and economic decision-making. So for all this to happen, countries have to work to get the right nature-smart policies in place. And as both Gianni and also Anderson explained, these kinds of policies are also smart choices for economic growth. We can afford it, but what we cannot afford is inaction on these topics. There's a broad consensus that the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that you all are working so hard on needs to mobilize economic and financial and private stakeholders for really decisive action. And the World Bank is actively supporting this process through advancing the economics and the financing thinking for nature. We all need to be rowing in the same direction, so to speak, working together to maximize all of our impact. We will launch the report that you heard about today on June 30th. And in July, we are also going to publish a World Bank Group approach paper on biodiversity. And not surprisingly, we are building the findings of the economics and the finance work you heard about today into our approach of how we look at biodiversity and nature. And it will also not surprise you that in our approach, we really look at it as a development issue. Nature is a development issue. We are very much looking forward to the outcomes from Kunming, which we hope will be very ambitious. We continue to be ready to work with countries, as I said earlier in my intervention, to follow through on the targets and help with the transition to nature smart development and to mitigate the risks and the trade-offs. I wish you very well with your deliberations and thank you for the important work you are doing to put our planet on a more sustainable course. And with that, thank you very much, and I turn it back to David.
Thank you very, very much, Karen, for those remarks and for the support that we're receiving from the bank towards our work going forward. So the final speaker who will close us off for today is Elizabeth Brema, the Executive Secretary to the Convention. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. And through you, my sincere thanks first to Jochen Weigel, who together with me officiated this event, but also more so to other World Bank colleagues, Jan, Anderson, Karin, for all the sentiments we have heard, and now particularly the content of the report, which we are looking forward to read it after 30th June when it is launched. I believe I also speak on behalf of all of us when I state that it was indeed a great pleasure to listen to the most interesting presentations made on the results of this important work. I also wish to thank you for your pertinent questions and to the reach. I know when it comes to discussions after presentation, time is never enough, but at least you will agree we have managed to allocate what I call adequate time and responses we have received. I think World Bank colleagues clearly have seen how interesting these findings are, and clearly that many of us are looking forward to reading the details of what is in that document. I'm sure this work will further generate particular attention and further discussions in the coming months. And at this stage, from me, I think I can just mention 3 key insights which have come out of from my perspective. One, that the report confirms that, yes, there are growth reducing effects of implementing effective biodiversity policies, but that globally, these are largely offset by the growth stimulating effects of maintaining and restoring biodiversity and ecosystems. 2, the report highlights that the impacts of economic growth are so significant, the extent that driven by climate-related benefits and services of achieving synergies in implementing the 3 Rio Conventions, namely on climate change, biodiversity, and desertification and land degradation. And 3, and finally, from my perspective, the work shows clearly that while in terms of economic growth, the costs and benefits of more stringent conservation cancels each other at global level, and the distribution of these costs and benefits varies considerably across country income groups. While low-income countries tend to lose most from the loss of ecosystem services in terms of percentage decline, they also stand to lose most in terms of the cost of conservation. This result will certainly require more analysis and reflection in the coming months for us in the lead up to our Conference of the Parties 15, which, as you know, is scheduled to consider and adapt the post-2020 global biodiversity. Co-chairs have heard the content of the report, have shared their preliminary views on that, and hopefully thinking how best to further reflect them in the framework moving forward. Colleagues, as you know, just a bit of about a week ago, we also concluded the first virtual part of our subsidiary bodies meeting as one of the critical stepping stones to our road to Kunming, Conference of the Parties 15. While we made some progress at these meetings, there still remains considerable amount of work to be done, and it will be critical for us to maintain and further increase momentum and negotiation dynamics in the months ahead. So from this perspective, this work of the World Bank and the release of its results is very timely for these discussions, as it highlights again the urgence of more effective biodiversity policies in the coming decade and of the economic opportunities that come with it, but also that these opportunities are not spread evenly across countries and regions, and that there is need to address this also. I wish to express my deep, deep appreciation to the World Bank and all the World Bank dedicated staff for this important work, and for you colleagues who have shared with us the outcome, the results, the highlights from that report, and mentioned also other reports like the one Anderson also dwelt and deep dive on it. Of course, for convening all of us today to present all these results, I say again, thank you, and thank you all participants for joining us. Back to you, David.
Thank you very, very much, Elizabeth. Well, the conversation comes to a close for today, but I hope that we will continue this discussion going forward as we negotiate the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, as we move forward on its implementation mechanisms, and as this overall debate or discussion goes forward and all the mechanisms and methodologies to better understand our way forward. So thank you to our presenters, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to all of you for taking time to join us today in this important work. So we will see each other again very, very soon. Be well and be safe. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye. Bye.